fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 32, It's About Time. Companions? Lucas was certain he had heard this giant, muscled woman wrong. Or perhaps she meant to use a different word, like fellow prisoners, or sacrifices, or... He licked his lips, unable to keep his mind from spiraling down an endless tunnel of the horrible fates that awaited them, each one worse than the last. He glanced back up at the queenly figure, his voice trembling. I think, maybe you have the wrong people. This is all of us. He forced a grin on his face, though he didn't feel it in his core. You're not gonna feed us to some ginormous pet dragon, are ya?
Oh, don't be ridiculous,
Atlas groaned, finally managing to pull himself to his feet. His head swam with pain and magical exhaustion, but, hand planted firmly against the robot for support, he stood steady.
Dragons are extinct.
Oh, that's good. Lucas swallowed hard. What about other terrifying monsters? At the fear-ridden plain on the young dryad's face, Auxilia responded the only way she knew how. She reached out a finger and booped him on the nose. Fear not. My giant three-headed dog has already eaten for the day. Her delighted tone faded when her eyes flashed white for the briefest of moments. Ah, more guests are about to arrive. She straightened up, turning to the large, unguarded door off to the right of the room. As if on cue, a group of bodies slammed inside. Lucian, finally managing to wrench his arm free from his captor, brushed his hands down the front of his robes and straightened his back.
Do you have any idea who I am?
His power stance was ruined only by the wobble of his crooked leg. Winter was thrust forward by his guard, his fingers wrapped tightly on the cloak around his waist. He spun around to face the room and whatever awaited them, to see a long, empty hall and 5 new strangers. But the one closest to him caught his attention the most. She had giant wings with multicolored feathers and a wide, toothy smile on her face. His entire life, Winter's grin had elicited a fear response in others, something unintentional and primal. Seeing this woman, he finally understood what that felt like. Guys? His hand began slapping around for someone. Unluckily, his fingers grabbed onto the once Regent Lord as she approached them, her every movement an act of powerful grace. A predator deciding whether it wanted to pounce or not.
Mother?
The word, laced with an icy venom, fell from Lucian's lips as he shoved past the lichen. Auxilia stopped before her son and narrowed her eyes down at the child she hadn't seen since her departure from her husband all those years ago. He had grown into something, well... Pride was not the word for the emotions running through her as she took him in. This lady, with all the wings and feathers, is your mother? Winter scratched nervously at the top of his head with his free hand, his eyes shifting between the woman and her son. He did this several times before clicking his tongue against his teeth. Kind of explains why you're such a puffed-up peacock.
Be silent, you filthy mongrel,
Lucian hissed the insult with a narrowed look of hatred. Auxilia raised a hand towards the side of her son's head, eliciting a flinch, but she did not strike him. Her fingers brushed lightly against his chin instead. I taught you better than that. He swiveled that hateful scowl up towards her.
How could you, if you were never there?
Outwardly, Lucian seethed with disdain and contempt. Seeing his mother standing there, one eyebrow cocked in disapproval, he felt no love or joy for her. But inside, deep down, hid that tiny child that nearly drowned in a lake, rescued to the safety of her arms, her warmth. And that secret part of him wailed in disappointment for an approval that he knew he'd never receive.
Don't pretend we are more than strangers.
He waved a hand at the guards that still surrounded them, weapons at the ready.
Especially after how we were greeted.
Oh, my baby boy. She patted his cheek gently, though her lips formed a hard line on her face. You will always have my love, Auxilia sighed. But you have to earn my respect.
How can I, when you choose to hide yourself away instead?
Her tapping gesture turned into a sharp slap. Just because I've been here doesn't mean that I am blind to your actions. Her expression hardened further. You killed my husband and brought the kingdom we worked so hard to build to ruin. All because you were jealous of your half-human brothers. His silence told her she had struck a nerve, and she shook her head slowly. With a sigh, Auxilia flicked her attention over to the third man, leaning heavily against one of her guards for support, and she approached. Varen had heard, more from his mother than his father, the tales of the Wild Queen, of her power and her important role in keeping the enshrined wilds safe from human interference. How she was a goddess in her own right, and protected more than just the magic locked in the autumn expanse. But as she stepped in front of him, nearly 7 feet tall and towering over him, the stories could never hope to capture her true might. You are not, what I expected. Auxilia tilted her head, taking in the bedraggled appearance of her husband's child. He was filthy, disheveled, and pale. He so resembled the pauper of the story instead of the prince, and she tutted gently. Zelfia's lineage was truly watered down by that human mother of yours. Varen's eyes went wide, taken aback. He tolerated much. Insults directed at himself, painful jabs at all his failures, impatience with his inability to speak. But this one, he absolutely did not. He wanted to scream, "Don't you dare say a bad thing about my mother!" But he had no voice, no shadow creature to stitch his shade closed enough for him to speak. He settled on twisting his features into an expression he hoped conveyed that message, and clenched his hands into fists at his side, fingernails digging painful divots into his palms. A surprised smile graced Auxilia's face. All of this, from the moment the three had entered, had been only a hum of unintelligible noise to Lucas. He had not breathed, for he could not remember how. His world had fallen silent. Despite his remaining functioning implant, the only sound was the pounding of his heart. The ground swayed beneath his feet, and he returned his grip to Ondine's arm. There, standing not even 20 feet from him, was the love of his life, still unaware of his presence. Time had been unkind to him, and it tugged at his heartstrings. His black hair, which was much longer now, ended in white, with thick bands streaking the untidy braids that hung over one shoulder. A long scar stretched down the left side of his face, dulling the green of the eye there. But they were still the same ones he used to lose himself in. A small part of Lucas's mind screamed, "Notice me!" But he couldn't encourage the words from his mouth. "Your Majesty!" A new voice rang out, drawing all eyes to the door behind them. But not Lucas's. No. He kept his focus on the man he had given up for dead, and the one he couldn't stop thinking about in his final days at the hotel. As a group of people rushed in, Vel's gaze moved in his direction, looking just past him. "Notice me, please! We need to send out a scouting party." It was a woman's voice. "Our group was split, and—" Whatever else the woman had to say dissolved into static as their eyes met. Vel saw him. Him! Lucas's breath caught in his throat, his mouth dry. 7 years. That's how long he'd been without that gravitational pull, that completion, that wholeness that was his other half. But he couldn't move. His stupid feet had forgotten how. Thankfully, Vel started stumbling forward, falling into a run. A million emotions coursed through Lucas in that moment. Fear, anxiety, sadness, happiness, hope, love. And he started to raise his hands, to reach out with a welcoming embrace, when his world shattered as the man ran right past him, close enough that it ruffled his hair. "We need a—" "Oh!" Pyra's words were cut from her mouth when someone embraced her, plucking her up off her feet and spinning her around. She cried out in surprise and looked down, eyes widening in realization as elation and relief flooded her fingertips and toes. "You're alive!" She wrapped her arms around Varen as he set her back down to her feet, but held her tight.
If you love her, don't let her go. You'll regret it for the rest of your life if you do.
Just one of the pearls of wisdom that cranky old cyborg had given up before he departed. It was spoken from a place of understanding, and right now, Varen understood. Their past did not matter, only this moment, and the more he resisted, the weaker he felt. He let all of his worries and doubts fade, cast aside his fears about the issues that might arise, and guided her lips to his. After a momentary hesitation, Pyra slid her hands in his hair, pulling him deeper, hungry and desperate to never let him go again. When a chorus of gasps, loudest coming from the once Regent Lord, reminded her they weren't alone, she broke away, her cheeks flushed with heat, but she didn't look at any of them. Her eyes locked only on the prince as she let out a wet laugh, tears prickling her vision. "You idiot! You've been here this whole time!" She smacked her fist into his chest. "Don't you ever scare me like that again!" White-hot pain tore through him as his arrow wound ripped open again, and Varen nearly shoved the queen away as he dropped to one knee, teeth grit in agony. "Oh my God, did I do that?" In the background, Lucas steadied himself with the help of Undine, and he blinked up at her. "When?" His voice broke over the word, and he swallowed, steeling himself to try again. "When you said Vel was alive, you didn't tell me he had moved on." Frowning, she looked down at her little brother, and then over at the display unfolding before them, and then broke out laughing. It was not meant to wound, but at the hurt look on his face, she composed herself with a cough, patting his hand gently. "That is not your bow." "What?" "That is Prince Varen." Undine smiled. "A parallel something or other. That is what Vel called it. I don't understand any more than they look alike. A parallel variant is likely to arise in adjacent dimensions due to a high probability of observable similarities, depending on the distance from the realm of origin." Lucas turned to the owner of that voice to find himself staring at a dark-skinned man with long blonde hair wearing a comically overlarge hat. "Huh?" He frowned, glancing between the newcomer and the Arcanist. The two had the exact same features, save for their hair and skin color. Well, that and the eye patch, and this person was much younger than Atlas. "That's why languages are interchangeable, and, holy sprockets! Unit 2? Bram, who was busy taste-testing the last of the rum he had pilfered, spun at the use of his old name.
"Egods!"
His head swiveled this way and that, moving between the Commodore and the, Commodore.
"There's two of you."
He glanced down at the bottle in his hand, and then back up.
"The sirens poisoned me grog, confuddling me mind."
"I'm so confused." Lucas looked up at Undine, his heart still reeling from the roller coaster of emotions. "So, that's not Vel?" He ran a hand over his mouth, unwilling to let the flutter of hope enter him. "Hey, everyone, stuff it!" Piper, tired of the delays and the drama, marched past her duplicate, still holding the hand of the prince, through the group of gawking men and Winter, to pull to a stop in front of this so-called wild queen. "I've got places to be and a friend to save. So, spit it out. Why the heck are we here?" Auxilia looked down at the young woman with a knowing smile. The girl showed no fear, no hesitation brought on by her divine aura. "I like you." She folded her muscled arms over her chest with a shrug. "I could tell you, but in all honesty, I tend to tune him out whenever the topic comes up, and it comes up a lot. End of the world, he's always wailing." She sighed and waved a hand flippantly. "I'll let my advisor explain it." The phrase, "end of the world," had grabbed everyone's attention, and they all grouped closer at the swirling portal that opened 6 feet off the ground. A man dropped from it, landing on the marble floor with a clumsy thud. Varen, the most curious of them, pushed his way to the front of the crowd as the portal snapped shut and the man struggled to stand. He was older, well north of middle-aged. His silver hair and unkempt beard were streaked with the memories of black. As he stood, he dusted off his clothing, a well-loved fur-lined coat that was more patch than original leather, and a striking floral garment. His hands were black, as if they had been dipped in buckets of ink only moments ago. He was twitchy, spinning on the spot to check his surroundings as he touched each pocket in turn.
Huh? It's today! At last!
He frowned.
Wait, maybe? No, it is!
He looked around the room, crow's feet and smile lines crinkling his pale skin, until he began to focus on the group of faces before him.
The gathering!
He grinned wide, unaware, or uncaring, that no one smiled back.
Right, so I called you all here to...
He paused, staring intently at the tall, half-naked man.
No, this isn't right.
Winter pulled a face as he felt unfamiliar hands grab him by the shoulders and shuffle him 2 feet to the left.
Yes, that's better. Okay, so...
He clapped his hands together.
I called you all here to tell you we are doomed.
The angry buzzing of wasps filled Lucas's ears. His hair was longer, parts of it braided beneath a sloppy man bun, and the glasses on his face were more elegant than he had ever seen. Oh, but it was definitely him. He shoved his way through all the others, coming to a stop at the front of the group. "Eric?" Turning in response to his name was muscle memory. He didn't even register who had said it, but he was ready to answer the impending question, "Why are we doomed?" when Eric's eyes landed on a familiar face and horns and that golden earring. His mouth dried into a desert almost instantly, and he took a cautionary step back.
"Oh, Lucas."
He swallowed hard.
"You're not supposed to be here."
Lucas shoved up the sleeves of his sweater, first to the right, then the left, as he stalked forward. "What the fuck?"
"Oh no."
In a twisted castle, on a twisted throne, sat a twisted old man with a twisted crown of bone. And with his twisted son and their twisted hearts of stone, the two would rule over all of the twisted ever sown. And so these twisted men played their twisted games, waiting for the goddess with her holy wrath untamed. And for this queen of night, the twisted king proclaimed they would wait and build an army to follow in her name, to take back what was hers by steel and by flame. Fables always had such silly origins. She knew this to be true. But as Rivaria stepped out of the dark root gate and into the great hall, she was greeted by just that. Everything around her, from the gabled windows and chandeliers to the dining chairs and tables, were wrought from gnarled black metal, not iron, of course. All of it formed to resemble the lifeless and twisted trees that surrounded the ancient structure. The runner beneath her feet was an elegant shade of indigo, dotted with diamonds to resemble constellations and stars in the sky. She followed them towards the head of the room, dancing around them and careful to avoid even the smallest of gems. Such beautiful craftsmanship was time-consuming after all. The noise in the great hall grew louder as raucous conversation burst through the kitchen doors. A young man, with one feathery moth wing and the other a latticework of silver and lace, stomped into view, screeching at the attendants and servants that trailed him. "Father!" Hollow swatted at the nearest Fae who attempted to offer aid, spinning on the terrified soul.
"We said enough! We do not need your fussing! Begone!"
He had to repeat himself several times before they departed, scurrying from his wrath like the roaches when the fire was lit. He whirled back to the old man that sat in his ever-twisted throne.
"We need all your soldiers, every last fighter, and conscript any peasant strong enough to wield a weapon."
He looked down at his old man, unsure if the ancient Fae had heard a single word. Beneath the heavy crown of bleached white bone, a few wisps of snowy hair stuck out in every direction. He wore glittering ebony robes with jeweled scarabs in radiant twilight hues, but his milky teal eyes were focused elsewhere.
"Father!" he shouted. "Have you heard a word we said? We need every able-bodied member of this kingdom to pick up arms. We mean to wage war on the Wild Queen and her vile offspring."
Tenebris Rhizon III was a simple man, nearing his 1,000th year. All he wanted was to live out his remaining days in peace and solace. Perhaps play a game or two of Catch the Queen with his wife. But as a muscle twitched under his left eye at the sudden shouting, he was reminded of the impracticality of such a thing with the boisterous young pup that still demanded so much of his attention. Climbing to his shaking feet, Tenebris shook out his robes and cloak until they tickled his ankles, and he whirled, backhanding his son with a fistful of rings. They caught the boy on the cheek, causing him to spin and catch himself with the throne. He may be old, but power still lingered in his ancient bones.
"Fool of a child, where are your manners? Have I not taught you that you must kneel in the presence of royalty?"
His hand moved to his bleeding cheek, his mouth agape. Hollow couldn't remember the last time the king requested that he bow before him, especially when they were alone. "Father, we're sorry. We don't—"
"It is not I to whom you need apologize."
Hollow stopped when the old man gestured to someone he hadn't caught sight of before. Standing in the middle of the Twilight Runner was a man? A woman? The clothes draped on their frame were ornate, sheer, and wispy. Their hair, black with a shock of white near their bangs, was pulled up into elegant braids that wrapped around each of the 2 sets of antlers on their head. A veil of glittering gems on a bed of sheer black fabric obscured their face. But it was the armor worn across the chest and arms that caused Hollow to immediately drop to his knees, bowing his head. A 6-legged deer trampling a winged serpent. "Forgive us, Night Mother. We did not know you had been reborn." Rivaria smiled, unfurling her arms from behind her back to gesture to the boy.
"Rise, you are forgiven."
Tenebris slapped Hollow on the shoulder, urging him to his feet.
"I was not expecting a visit, goddess. How may I and my night court serve you?"
"Oddly enough, your son has the right idea."
Rivaria took several steps forward, approaching that twisted old man, admiring his glittering dragonfly-like wings that rustled nervously behind him.
I'm here to settle a score.
She looked up at the large banner that hung behind the throne, acknowledging the same symbol that emblazoned her armor.
You once promised me an army. I'm here to collect.
Tuck that somewhere out of sight. That's all the hotel manager had told Zachariah, refusing to elaborate before she stomped off. Now he was heaving a stone statue of a woman towards long-term storage, a task that should have been easy if he had the proper equipment. He was a horrible janitor, but he could navigate his way around a tool shed. When he had tried to get the manager to order him a proper hand truck and tie-downs, Miranda absolutely balked at the shipping costs and told him to make do with what he had. One broken serving cart and several old crates later, he had fashioned himself it worked. If he hadn't been so handy, he knew the manager would have tossed him back out onto those impish streets as soon as his indentureship had ended. He had begged her to let him stay on, working for minimum wage, until he could scrounge together enough money to buy a ticket off this bizarre world. Progress was slow. She charged him almost as much in room and board as she paid him, but he was nearing the end of his stay. Soon he'd have enough to return home. The dolly creaked as it hit a crack in the hard stone floor, and Zachariah swore when the stone statue began to wobble. He reached out, bracing it with his free arm, and breathed out a puff of air when it stabilized. Whew, he needed to focus. Long-term storage was just at the end of this hallway. He tilted the hand truck and continued down the uneven concrete floor. But he could hardly keep his brain from wandering back to his family. Ever since he had heard his son's name, home was all he could think of. Sure, it probably wasn't an uncommon name here, having met his fair share of oddly titled folks during his stay, but that didn't stop the memory of his 2 young children and his wife from invading his thoughts. He longed to see them again, to regale Olivia and the kids with stories of Bigfoot and how not only were they real, but he had a poker game with a group of them every Wednesday night. He pulled to a stop outside the large, corrugated bay door. Reaching down, he hauled it open to reveal the massive, cluttered space beyond. Apparently, the storage room was infinite, if the stories were to be believed. No one had ever verified that, but Miranda had grumbled about having to pay workers' comp to a staff member that had been lost to its depths for 67 straight days. Zachariah grabbed the dolly and began navigating the precarious towers of junk, attempting to find a space to park the gaudy statue. Maneuvering around towering stacks of broken chairs and lost luggage, he traveled through the cluttered time capsule of the hotel's past. Why were they saving ripped curtains and half-eaten, yes, eaten, candlesticks? He finally found a small space between a table topped with artfully stacked crystal balls and a large 6-foot standing mirror. He let out a long sigh as he wheeled the statue into the spot. He looked around at all the junk, shaking his head. This felt as good a place as any for a statue of a crazed, god-killing psychopath. He tilted the figure forward, wiggling out the dolly, when one of the wheels snagged on the leg of the table. He yanked and tugged until it rolled free, but not before it rocked the crystal balls off their neat pyramid stack. They rolled free, some escaping this way and others that. Zachariah attempted to catch them, but there were too many, and within moments, the crashing sound of glass filled the endless space. One shot off the table, bounced off the boot of the statue, and careened into the standing mirror. No, 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 no! Zachariah watched as, missing one of its stabilizer legs, the mirror wobbled dangerously. It swayed back and forth until gravity overcame it, and it smashed into the statue. Both hands moved into his hair, gripping at the strands as he watched the stone figure crumble into a heap with the glass and mirror fragments. Several bird cages had toppled, causing a small chain reaction that sent precariously stacked goods of past abandonment collapsing down the entire length of the aisle. He groaned as he dropped into a squat, staring at the mess of broken junk. Miranda was absolutely going to kill him over this. He remained that way for 15 minutes before Zachariah convinced himself to find a broom and clean up the mess. If he removed any trace of wrongdoing, the manager would never have to know anything was broken. And if and when she did discover it, he'd hopefully be long gone. After locating a broom, he had just pushed the bristles to the mess when it shifted. He frowned, moving the broom back to the pile when there was a grunt and a hand shot from beneath the heavy frame of the now shattered mirror. Unashamedly, Zachariah screamed, and he slapped that hand with the end of the broom. At his second swing, those fingers grabbed hold of the handle and used his momentum to pull itself free. That crazed, God-killing woman stumbled out of the rubbish, undamaged. Zachariah took several steps back, eyes growing wide. How? A golden light shimmered across her skin once, before it faded entirely. Ruby groaned as she stretched upright, smiling at the satisfying snap her spine made as it was realigned. Turns out, being encased in a statue was hell on your back. She scanned around the room to see she was in the largest collection of junk, and there, standing between a cardboard cutout of a bellhop and an overturned couch in a faded puce color, was a man. He was wearing the gray uniform of a janitor. Perfect, she thought, as she approached. Her hand shot out and latched onto the man, hauling him in close. She ignored the terrified and high-pitched scream that came from him to push her nose to his. With all her remaining strength, she managed to choke out the words, "First portal, find it now." Sun filtered down through the opaque glass panes above him. The greenhouse was warm and filled with vibrant colors and light. People moved around him, though Vel didn't recognize any of their faces. They were just a blur, and, well, that was because there was only one person he was focused on. Lucas was standing with a customer, pointing towards a plant and signing simply and slowly, "Have a nice day." The radiant glow around him was probably from the water misters overhead catching the beams of sun from the glass ceiling, or it could be that that's how Vel always saw him. He wasn't ashamed to admit he was smitten. He smiled when the man caught him staring and waved. Vel signed back, "Did you forget your implants again?" Lucas barked out a silent laugh and nodded, signing, "I have to go cover a lunch. Do you need anything before I'm doomed to the registers for forever?" He shook his head, that smile only widening until it hurt his cheeks. Vel watched as Lucas moved towards the front of the store, and he turned back to his pallet of fertilizer, his Sisyphean task. The Dryad constantly wanted them moved from this spot to that spot, but he never complained. He reached down to grab one, when a sharp crackling pierced through his mind, blurring his vision. He dropped the bag, reaching out for something to steady him. But it was no use. Pain was rocketing around in his head. He clenched his eyes shut, hoping the darkness would reorient him. But something peculiar happened instead. Everything fell silent. No hum of conversation from the gaggle of customers. No noisy cars in the parking lot or on the freeway just beyond. The water misters fell silent, and so did his heartbeat. His mind began to race with panic when Vel couldn't feel anything. Not the ground beneath his feet, nor the stack of fertilizer he had used to steady himself. He opened his eyes, but only darkness pressed in on him. He coughed, choking on nothing as he found breathing suddenly difficult. He strained his muscles to pull in even the smallest breath, and then he was slammed back into the moment. He could feel a tremor in his feet and something struggling to free itself from his right hand. He blinked rapidly, expecting to find himself latched onto a customer instead of the pallet of bags, or... He stumbled back, crying out in alarm. Vel had his hand wrapped around the throat of an old man who sobbed shamelessly. Except it wasn't his hand. It was made of metal and machinery, and he could feel the power of the servos inside. He could crush this man's throat without effort. Terror and confusion ripped through Vel, and he did the only thing he could. He relinquished the old man, his eyes tracking where he fell. He gasped as he saw rivers of blood carving into the dirt and bodies scattered at his feet. The old man froze in a moment of disbelief. Tears pooled in both of Vel's eyes as he took in a glittering desert city filled with smoke and fire. Screams flew through the streets as the helpless were chased down by large armored insects. He looked down at himself, dressed in black and silver armor and covered in blood. And then he met the old man's gaze, and he... "Run," was all Vel could manage. There was hardly a breath between his warning and when the old man scrabbled to his feet and dashed towards the nearest alley, only for him to meet a grisly death at the end of the horn of a monstrous humanoid rhino beetle. Vel screamed, his vocal cords tearing at the anguish and horror that he reeled from. He made to move, to run and hide or fight, but his legs refused to work. He crumpled to his knees instead, blood soaking through the linens beneath his armor. He shoved his hands into his face, blacking out the visions as he screamed, "It's not real! It's not real! It's not..." And, as quickly as it had started, it was over. Vel was swimming in the nothingness once more. Darkness washed away the scent of iron and smoke and the blood from his hands. He barely had a moment to panic over floating in the void, his mind too busy trying to understand what he had just witnessed. Was it a dream? Probably. Definitely the weirdest one he'd had in a while. Where was he? Who were those people? That old man? Those things running in the street? A word bubbled up in his mind. Kavale, though he had no idea where he had heard that. The darkness evaporated with a pop, and he was, once more, standing in the greenhouse. The hum of customers moving about their day without a care filled his ears, the muggy heat sticking to his skin. Vel glanced down at himself, finding a red apron instead of that glittering black armor. He looked up to see Lucas, pointing to a plant before signing, simply and slowly, "Have a nice day." Vel frowned, unable to sharpen his focus. Hadn't he done this already? He lifted his hands from his sides, staring down at them. They were both normal hands, flesh and calloused from hard work, not covered in metal and blood. He startled when Lucas placed a hand in his, jumping back on instinct. "Are you all right?" the Dryad asked in sign language. "Did you forget your implants again?" Vel asked, his voice shaky. Lucas, reading his lips, barked a silent laugh and nodded. He signed, "I have to cover a lunch. Do you need anything before I'm doomed to the register for forever?" He didn't respond, but Lucas smiled at him anyway as he made for the front of the store. Vel watched him go, unable to shake the images that still flashed in his mind. Bodies, screaming, insects, blood. Maybe he blacked out when he picked up that bag of fertilizer and his brain concocted the whole thing. Yes, that had to be it. The fight-or-flight sensation began to ebb from his nerves as Vel relaxed. Last night, he'd fallen asleep in the middle of a graphic scene in his high fantasy novel. Perhaps his mind had been inspired by that. He let out a long sigh and turned back to his work. As he bent, reaching for the topmost bag of fertilizer, something wet ran down his left cheek, and he reached up to swipe it away, thinking it just sweat. But when he pulled his hand away, his fingers were coated with something inky and black. That concludes Of Risk and Relativity, Book 5 by Lesley Herron. Please check back soon for her upcoming novella, working title, A Quantum of Quiet, A Tale as Old as Time, which takes place between Book 5 and 6. We would like to thank you for joining us on this journey, and if you would like to listen to her other books and novellas, you can do so at talltaletv.com/series or by using the links in the description.
Wait. So you're telling me that you're the real Commodore Atticus?
Yes, we got separated when that building blew up. I'm so glad you're okay.
But if you're the Commodore, then who be this imposter here?
I told you, my name is Atlas, not Atticus.
A likely story. If I still had my cutlass, I'd split you nose to navel.
Wow, it looks like you found that pirate upgrade I made for you. Pity Vel would never let me use it before. Oh, I'm just so happy to see you alive. Give me a hug. Unit 2?
It's Bram now, if you don't mind, Commodore.
Oh, Bram, what have you got rattling around in your chest cavity?
What, this? Just a few trinkets I ferried away during our daring escape.
Oh my socket wrench.
I drank the booze, but saved the most precious of the booty for you.
Are these all Teakettles?
Every last one that scaly wench had stowed away.
This one has a hand-engraved silver inlay on the spout. And this one here, it has a red low-pitched shift whistler. Oh, and is this one a limited edition Krznov made entirely of tinted glass?
But where's all the rum gone?
No idea.